Hi and welcome to Programming Percy. Today we'll be talking about using structured logging in Go using the standard library. Go 1.21 has been released, and that allows us to now use a module called Slog, which is a submodule for the log library, which allows us to use structured logging in our applications. A few years ago, I wrote an article about how to do structured logging in Go. But in that article, I used Logrus or ZeroLog, which are third-party logging libraries which was needed at that time. Now with Slog or Slog, I'll go ahead and say Slog. With Slog, we can skip those dependencies. And skipping one extra third-party dependency is an amazing thing that I always strive for. If you're new to programming, you might say, what harm does come from using a third-party logging library? What's one extra dependency? Well, there's many reasons, but you should really look into Log4j and you will see what catastrophic events we can have from a simple log library that gets exploited and has security vulnerabilities. As our systems grows larger, logs and metrics get an increasingly important role in our systems. We need to understand what's going on and why things are happening, and to do that we use logs. And if you're just simply printing your logs in a text file and it's not structured, it will be very hard to use your logs. But if we have structured logs, we can instead use a ingestion program such as Promptail or Logstash or whatever to read the structured logs into our monitoring system, which will help us out a lot. Now, structured log does not have to be JSON. It is commonly JSON, but it doesn't have to be. It can be structured text rows, such as I think Syslog does it that way. So let's just skip ahead and let's start rolling. The first thing you need to do is that you need to go to Go's website and install at least a version above 1.21. If you do have a version lower than that, Slog will not be available. So let's go ahead and create a new directory. I'm going to go inside of that directory. Now we need to start a new module. So let's go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and start Programming Percy Slog test. We've created a new module. Let's also create a new file called main.go. To use Slog, we simply have to import it. So let's go ahead and do a new package main. We have to import log slog. Let's go ahead and use it. Let's create a main function. Let's go ahead and just print out a simple message. I'm going to print a info message. So let's do slog.info test, just to see how things roll. Open up a new terminal and run main.go. Bam! You can see here that the log message is being printed in a structured way. We have our date, we have the level, which is info, and we have our message. So that's great. So to use Slog, it's really easy. An important thing to understand about structured logging is log levels. So in our example, we used info, which is information. And in most logging libraries, the levels are hierarchical. So if we have a debug message, for instance, let's do a debug, my debug level. Now, debug level is lower in the hierarchy than the info, and it's important to understand that. If we decrease the log level that we want to see to info, let's say that we only want to see info log messages, we will no longer see the debug message. In Slog, there are just 4 log levels, so it's very easy to get started. We have the debug, which is the lowest level. It should print basically anything. We have info, which is the next level, which is information, about stuff that's going on in the system. We have warn, which is warning. So that's a little bit higher up. Now something is starting to be strange in the application. So it's a warning. And we have errors. Errors is basically something has gone wrong. The way we use log levels in Slog is that we use level functions. I call them level functions because basically it's what we see here. If I want to debug a log line, I use the debug function. The great thing about these level functions is that they all look the same way. They're functions that accepts a message followed by a variadic amount of arguments. And we will cover these arguments very shortly. So we have the debug, info, warn, and error. Simple enough. Let's go ahead and run this. And boom, you see the info, warn, and error. What happened to debug? Well, we haven't set the level, but the default slog handler is set to information. If the error level was set to error, we wouldn't see the warnings or the info message or anything below. It's important to understand the hierarchy of the log messages. Now, when we're using slog like this, we're using the default handler. A handler is something that will print out logs. This is the way we use the default one. If you jump into these functions, you will see they use the default function .log, and the default is going to use a default logger. So that is great if we just want to test things out like this. But what if we want to customize stuff and change how stuff behaves? We can do that using handlers. Now, there are currently two supported handlers in Slog, which is the JSON handler and the text handler. JSON will output the log as a JSON, and text will output something similar to this. What we see here is actually the format that they create, that Slog creates with something called the default handler. The default handler is not the text handler. This is a text handler which has some formatting applied. So let's go ahead and try using a handler. Let's create a new handler so we can use it and see how we can do that. Now, one great thing about this is if we do new, slog.new, you can see a bunch of functions, but the ones we want is to create new handlers. And you can see new JSON handler and new text handler. What's great about them, again, is that they are following the same function signature. So we can easily replace them with each other if we change our mind which one we want to use. I'm going to go ahead and create a text handler. Now, the first input to the text handler is a IO writer. I always want my logs to go to standard out because I usually ingest my logs from a Docker or stuff like that. So let's just go ahead and add os.standardout. And let's import os so you also find that. So we have our place to write the logs to. Now we need to apply a handler options. The handler option is a struct inside the slog module. So let's go ahead and let's just take a look at it to see what it is. So we have the handler option. I'm just going to go to it and let's see what it says. The handler options are options for text handlers and JSON handlers. So we have a add source boolean, and if we make this true, we will see the current line inside our program or source code that triggers the log. We're going to enable that. We can see that we can set the log level. So if I don't want the debug logs, I can set this to info, for instance, and we will no longer see the debugs. And we have something called replace attribute. We will take a look at replace attribute later, but basically, if we want to change a time field called time, for instance, we can change that to instead be named date and use a different formatting. We can do that with replace attributes, which is great. But let's go back to our code. So we need to create the slog options. So let's just go ahead and create that. And also, this is supposed to be a pointer, I think. Yeah. So a pointer to our new slog handler options. I want to set the log level, and I want to print all the logs. I want to see the debug. So set the log to slog.levelDebug, which is a constant. And so we don't have to use hard-coded strings. That's nice. I also want to see where in the source code the log message comes from. So let's go ahead and set add source to true. We go ahead and we create a new text handler. We also need to accept the output, which is a log handler. This is a log handler. This isn't a logger. Now that we have the handler, which knows how to extract and use the logs, we need to create a logger object. So let's go ahead and create a logger and do slog.new. And we can look at new here. We see new function accepts a slog handler. And that's great. We have a slog handler. So let's do log handler as an input. Now we need to replace the slog.debug to logger, because otherwise we will be using the default logger. We don't want to use the default logger. We want to use our own customized logger. So in short, we create a log handler and we configure it. We create a new logger using our log handler, and then we print a bunch of stuff. So let's go ahead and run it. And you can see that we now see a lot of different logs. It looks different. This is not the default handler. This is the text handler. So the timing is changed. And we can see each of these level equals warning. We can see the source since we added add source. We can see where in the source code this was printed. So the warning comes from main.go line 19, which is pretty amazing. It's really helpful when you debug stuff. I do recommend to add that. If we look at these log lines, we can see this time equals a timestamp, level equals error, for instance. And this is known as attributes. We can add custom attributes by passing extra attributes into the logger function. Remember that the log functions accepted a variadic amount of arguments, right? You can see here it accepts many args. And these arguments are how we can pass custom data into the logger. What if we want to log stuff such as application version or some metric that we need to understand what's going on? We can do that simply by adding them here. So these attributes are really great. An example would be if you have your application is deployed in multiple regions on AWS, for instance. Now you see in your monitoring tool, such as Prometheus, for instance, you can see that the application is acting up. It's printing a bunch of errors. And it can be really helpful if you see that it's not just the application, it's the Europe region, for instance, that is acting up. And it can really help you narrow down fast what's going on. So adding these custom values is really important. Let's just remove all the log messages to make it a little bit easier to read. And we'll go ahead and say, so what's the meaning of life, for instance? We want to answer to meaning of life. And we want to add custom metrics to this message. So let's add the key answer and the value 42. It's always key values when it comes to attributes. Let's go ahead and run that. And we can see it prints what's the meaning of life as our message, and the answer is equals to 42. We have successfully added an attribute to our log message, which is great. And this way of adding stuff is nice. It's quite simple, but it gets messy real quick. If you have many attributes, it's not going to be nice. It's going to be hard to understand what's related. Also, there's performance implications because you have to infer what's going on. You have to map them together in the background, of course, but there's performance issues. So instead, according to the documentation for Slog, they actually recommend us to use something called log attributes. So Slog module comes with a bunch of attributes by default, which we can use, and they come in the form of as functions. So if we do slog.int, we can see that we have a function called int, which accepts a key value pair, And all of these functions accept key value pairs and returns the attribute. So let's just replace the things that we had with answer, and the value is 42. Go ahead and rerun it. And we should see the same output, which is amazing. And I do recommend you to use, there's a bit more typing to slog.int instead of just saying answer and 42, but it really makes the code cleaner, a little bit more stuff to read, but much cleaner, especially if you have a bunch of attributes. It's just so worth the trade-off. Now sometimes we might have attributes which are actually related. At those times we can create something called a attribute group, which is nice because then we can chain the attributes together into one nested JSON. So let's just go ahead and try it. It's much easier to see what's actually going on. So I'm actually going to share my best Pokemon rating with you guys. And the way we do that is we do a debug, same as before. The input parameter is going to be an attribute. So let's do a slog dot, but instead of int or string or anything, let's try a group. So it's a group of values. Let's call our group votes, because these are the votes for my Pokemon ratings. And let's go ahead and say I have a integer called Pikachu, and he has 40 votes. And then we have a second integer, which is Mew, and Mew has 24 votes. Let's go ahead and save that. So we have created a group called votes, which has 2 attributes in it. So we're missing a colon. Let's add that. Let's run our program again, and you will see votes.pikachu equals 40 and votes.mew equals 24. So that's really amazing. And this allows us to chain stuff together. One thing you can imagine is you might want to have system information inside a system group, for instance. So you can easily kind of filter out or navigate between the groups. It's just amazing to have. One thing before we proceed is we have a text handler right now. I don't really like the output of the text handler. So let's go ahead and try the JSON handler. And to do that, we simply rename the new text handler into new JSON handler. Remember, they have the same function signature, so we can simply do that and restart our program. And you can now see we're getting the logs as JSON instead, which to me looks a lot nicer. We might even pipe that to JQ, and we get these formatted, really nice log. So that's amazing, and we have our groups and everything looks good. But what if we have default values? Like, what if the system information we want to print, we want that to appear on all the log lines? We have this giant system. We don't want to add that all the time. What's amazing with Slog is that we can add attributes which are default attributes. Now we do that by going back to the log handler. Now I know there were only 3 fields here that we could modify, but we can actually call a function called with attributes. And with attributes accepts an array of attributes that will always get added to each log message. So let's just try and create a new array, and it's supposed to be slog.attributes. And let's just say we want to always print what's the meaning of life again, because that's always important to remember, you know. So let's just add that and rerun the program with JQ for now. We can see what's the meaning of life equals 42. That's being printed, which is amazing. So now we don't have to do that every time. We can simply configure our handler to always do it for us. And this is great and this is a great idea to print application information, maybe the version, some configuration that you need to know about. One even greater thing is that the group, the slog.group, is actually an attribute in itself. So what we can do, if I always want to print my Pokemon collection, for instance, I can just take my lines here and move them up and place them as an attribute in itself. So let's just format that so it looks better. Now the votes are being printed as a default, and that's also really nice. Again, with the system information, etc., you kind of just want to add those as default. Test. Let's try it out. So let's do logger debug test, and we can see it still prints the Pikachu ratings, the Pokemon votes, and the meaning of life. Everything by default. And this is great because you don't want to add all these attributes each time, for instance. So one thing that's quite annoying is if we create our logger like this, you have to pass the logger around. You can't do slog.debug anywhere and it will print, because we have our customized stuff inside the logger that we have created, which works. But if we take a look at, if we print my log message using slog.info, you will notice that that message is being printed as the same thing as before, because slog.info uses the default logger, not our sexy configured logger. But sometimes we might want that, because if we start up our program, we configure a nice cool logger, and we don't want to pass that around in our application, or you might want to, but in cases you don't want to, you might just want to replace the default logger with our logger. You can do that by doing slog.setDefault, and if we take a look at that, you can see sets the default logger of the package to use. So let's go ahead and just insert our logger as the default. Let's go here again and let's redo a info, new info. Let's rerun our program, and you will now see two JSON strings being printed. Our regular log and the second log message, which is great. This is what we want. We want it to, whenever we use slog in our modules, we just want to do slog.info, and you want it to work with whatever logger you have set up. There's one other approach, which is where you add the slog to the context, or if you pass the slog logger along inside of your application. But I don't really like that approach because it's just it's messy. Now, one final thing that we might need to do is that we might need to replace attributes. And one reason for that is if we take a look at the current logs, you will see that it prints time, for instance. And it prints the time in a certain format, which might not be the format that we want. Let's just say we want to change the time to another format. I want to print the time as a date field instead, and I want the time to be printed as Unix timestamps. Now we can go back to our log handler when we create it, and we can take a look at the replace attribute field. Replace attribute is a function which accepts a group, and the group is basically the group where the parameter belongs to, and it's an array of strings. And then it accepts the attribute as a second parameter. So let's just go ahead and create that. And it was, there's no autocomplete for that. String, and we want a, which is our attribute, and we want to return a attribute. So we are accepting the current attribute that is being parsed, and we return another attribute. This allows us to modify it. If I do a now, which is the slog attribute, you can see we have the key value fields. We have the key and we have the value fields. So what we can do is we can match the key that we want. And we want to change the time key. So let's go ahead. If a.key is equals to slog.timekey. One great thing about Slog is they keep constants for everything that you might need to know. So the time key is a constant for the time field. So let's go ahead and see whenever the attribute that is being logged is the same as the time, I want to change the key to date. So rename to date. And then I also want to change the value to Unix time. The Unix time is an int64 value. And we want time.now. And we want the time as Unix. So we're getting a warning here. All right. So we have modified the attribute whenever it's a time attribute. Now we just simply need to return it. And then we also need to add a comma. And we also have to import time. So let's import time. Now that that's done, basically that's all we need to do. So replace attributes allows us to iterate over the attributes, and whenever we find the attribute that we want, change it and we return it. Let's go ahead, let's restart our program and see what happens. We can now see time is no longer there, it's instead date, and it's the Unix timestamp. Great, we can replace the values that we want. We can replace the attributes that we want. And this is it for Slog. It's really a really small module which allows us to do structured logging in a really nice way. I think these kind of logs are really nice to just ingest, and they're really easy to work with, and the Slog module is really easy to work with. Basically, replacing attributes is the most advanced things we're gonna do with it, or that I ever do. Using the default attributes is just amazing to add stuff that we always want present. The application version, hardware information, region for the cloud being hosted. We have learned about the log levels. We have learned how to set the log level. We have to remember, if we set the log level to warning, we won't see info, we won't see debug, we will only see logs that are above in the severity. And we have also learned how we can replace the default logger for the Slog module with our customized logger. But I really hope you enjoyed it. And if you do, please feel free to like and subscribe to my channel.